In an astonishing breakthrough, police have cracked a decades-long case using new DNA methods to identify serial rapist, the Beast of Bondi.
For over 20 years, he was known as Magoo, a devoted husband of 4 decades and a doting grandfather who spent his days working for the community and his weekends at the local football club. While Keith Sims enjoyed the warmth of a large family and a peaceful retirement in La Perouse, dozens of women lived in the shadow of the terror he had left in the parks and bedrooms of Sydney's eastern suburbs. How did a man responsible for 31 violent attacks live a perfectly respectable life in the very same neighborhood as his victims, only to escape justice by exactly 14 days? If cases like this are why you're here, subscribe and turn on notifications. Cold trail documents fully sourced cases from verified court records and law enforcement files. What comes next changes everything. They were joggers in Centennial Park at dawn, walkers along the Bondi cliffs catching the sea breeze, women sleeping in their own beds in Clovelly and Coogee. Between 1985 and 2001, 31 women ranging from a 14-year-old girl with her whole life ahead of her to a 55-year-old woman were ambushed by a man they never saw coming. The youngest was carrying nothing but her house keys. Others were wearing their favorite tracksuits for a morning run. One moment, they were enjoying the quiet of a Sydney suburb, and the next, a shadow emerged from the darkness with a knife. The safety of their world vanished. The attacker used a consistent pattern. Tracksuit, the smell of cigarettes, face hidden. He struck across 16 years, leaving biological evidence at 12 of the crime scenes. But in the 1980s and 90s, the technology to identify the donor simply didn't exist. Investigators meticulously stored the DNA profiles, a microscopic biological signature waiting for a world that could finally read it. NSW police launched multiple inquiries, but the sheer span of years and the dispersed nature of the attacks led them to believe they were hunting multiple different men. Every time a new sample was run through the criminal databases, it returned the same result: no match. The offender had no prior record. The trail went cold. The Bondi Beast stopped striking. The files were moved to the back of the archives. For over 20 years, the survivors lived through birthdays, holidays, and milestones, always looking over their shoulders. Then in 2019, NSW police established Strike Force Doreen, a specialized team tasked with using a controversial new scientific weapon to look at the files one last time. What my research discovered was that the answer had been waiting in plain sight all along, hidden not in a database of criminals, but in the family trees of ordinary people who had no idea what their DNA would reveal. The first crime scene was catalogued on the 22nd of March 1985. A woman attacked in Centennial Park while jogging at dawn, then another in September, then 3 more in 1986. The pattern was unmistakable: ambush from behind, a knife, minimal conversation. The attacker wore tracksuits, sometimes blue, sometimes grey, and reeked of cigarette smoke. He covered his face with his hand or turned away from streetlights. He was methodical. Police collected biological samples from 12 of the 31 crime scenes: semen, skin cells, saliva. In the late 1980s, DNA profiling was in its infancy. Australia had no national database. The technology to extract a usable profile from degraded samples didn't exist yet. But the forensic scientists understood what they had. They stored the evidence in temperature-controlled facilities. They labeled it. They waited. What my research discovered was that those 12 samples were processed into preliminary DNA profiles by the mid-1990s, but they sat in isolation. There was nothing to compare them to. The profiles were like fingerprints lifted from a crime scene in a world without a fingerprint database. Perfect evidence, no match. The samples remained in storage, refrigerated and untouched, for over 2 decades. What nobody knew yet was that those 12 biological signatures would one day tell a story no witness ever could. NSW police launched Strikeforce Heart in 1994 to investigate what they called the Bondi serial rapist. Detectives interviewed hundreds of witnesses. They canvassed parks. They staked out jogging paths at dawn. Survivors described a man in his 20s or 30s, medium build, fit enough to overpower them quickly. But the attacks were spread across 16 years and multiple suburbs: Centennial Park, Bondi, Clovelly, Randwick, Coogee. Different precincts, different investigators. The DNA samples were run through the National Criminal Database, NCIDD, the National Criminal Investigation DNA Database. Every time a new profile was added, every time the result came back the same. No match. The offender had never been arrested, never been fingerprinted, never been in the system. The last confirmed attack occurred in 2001, then silence. Detectives theorized the offender had died, moved interstate, or been incarcerated for an unrelated crime. Without fresh leads, the case files were transferred to the cold case unit. The evidence remained preserved. The profiles remained in the database, running automatically against every new entry. Then the years began to move. The survivors aged, the detectives retired, and the 12 samples sat waiting in a freezer in Sydney, patient and permanent. For the 14-year-old girl attacked in 1988, her 16th birthday came and went. Then her 18th, her 21st. She graduated from university. She married. She had children of her own. Every milestone carried the weight of a question that had no answer. Was he still out there? Was he watching? Would he come back? The 55-year-old woman attacked in her own bedroom in 1998 spent years unable to sleep without the lights on. She moved twice, changed her phone number, told almost no one. The trauma didn't fade, it just learned to hide in the routine of ordinary life. What my research discovered was that across 2 decades, the survivors lived parallel lives marked by the same invisible calendar. Anniversaries of the attacks, news reports about other cases, every shadow in a park, every man in a tracksuit. In 2019, NSW Police established Strikeforce Doreen. The directive was simple: review every unsolved sexual assault case in the eastern suburbs with preserved biological evidence. The team was small. The technology they planned to use was controversial, and the case files they pulled from storage hadn't been opened in over 15 years. What they were about to do had never been attempted in Australia on this scale. Cold Trail is one of the few channels that builds every episode from verified court records and law enforcement documents. If that matters to you, subscribe. Justice took 37 years to arrive. Stay until the end. Investigative genetic genealogy works like this. You take the killer's DNA profile and upload it to public genealogy databases, GEDmatch, Family Tree DNA, where millions of people have voluntarily submitted their own genetic data to find distant relatives. The system doesn't look for the killer. It looks for his third cousins, his great-great-grandparents' other descendants. People who share fragments of the same DNA but have no idea they're related to a violent offender. Strikeforce Doreen partnered with Othram, a Texas-based forensic genealogy lab. The lab built a family tree starting with 324 distant genetic relatives. Then they cross-referenced birth records, marriage certificates, census data, and obituaries. The tree narrowed. 324 became 120, then 60, then 12. What my research discovered was that the final branch came down to a single family line in the La Perouse and Maroubra area, a working-class neighborhood less than 5 kilometers from where many of the attacks occurred. The genealogists identified 3 male descendants of the right age. 2 were ruled out through public records. 1 remained. The name that emerged from the biological data was Keith Sims. Keith Sims was 74 years old. He had worked for the National Parks and Wildlife Service for over 20 years, then spent a decade in security at the University of New South Wales. He was a familiar face at the local football club, a grandfather, a husband of 4 decades. His nickname was Magoo. He lived in La Perouse, a suburb bordered by Botany Bay, less than 10 minutes from Centennial Park. He had lived there since the 1980s. He had walked the same streets as his victims, shopped at the same stores, breathed the same air. When Strikeforce Doreen moved to confirm the genetic match with direct DNA, they arrived at his home in early March 2022. What they discovered was that Keith Sims had died of kidney failure on the 16th of February 2022, 14 days before the warrant was issued. His body had already been cremated. Police obtained a DNA sample from his personal effects. The match was definitive. 12 crime scenes, 31 victims, 1 man. At a press conference in May 2022, Detective Superintendent Mick Huxley addressed the survivors directly. "We know this doesn't bring back the years you lost," he said, "but we can give you a name. We can give you the truth." Sim's family released a statement expressing shock and devastation. They had no knowledge of his crimes. They described him as a loving father and grandfather who never showed any sign of violence. What my research discovered was that the final notification calls were made to the survivors in the weeks that followed. Some had waited 37 years. Some had built entire lives around the weight of not knowing. And now they knew. The man who destroyed their sense of safety had lived among them the entire time. Coaches at their children's football games, standing in line at the grocery store, growing old in plain sight. The investigation closed not with handcuffs, but with a name. And for the women who had carried that terror for decades, the name was enough. These 31 women waited up to 37 years for this. Their families waited 37 years for this. Cold Trail will keep documenting every case until every name has an answer. Subscribe. Share this. Their stories deserve to be heard.